sincerely diminished.
All right, welcome everyone. Tonight's event is titled American Indian Boarding Schools and the Doctrine of Discovery, a Community Conversation. This event is part of the 2021 One Book, One Community event series, which is centered on this year's title, Everything You Wanted to Know About Indians But Were Afraid to Ask by Anton Troyer. The mission of One Book, One Community is to encourage the community to read one book together. This year, the partnering organizations are the Fargo Public Library, Moorhead Public Library, West Fargo Public Library, the MSUM Library, Concordia College Library, NDSU Library, Historical and Cultural Society of Clay County, Moorhead Area Public Schools Indian Education, and the Indigenous Association. A major sponsor for this year's project is the Clean Water, Land, and Legacy Grant through the Lake Agassiz Regional Library. Other generous sponsors are the Friends of the Fargo Public Library, Concordia College Cultural Events, Friends of the West Fargo Public Library, Friends of the Moorhead Public Library, and Moorhead Community Education. Lots of libraries. For an entire list of the events and information about the author event with Anton Troyer, and that takes place on October 26th, please go to our website, which is onebookonecommunity.org. A couple of housekeeping items real quick for tonight. So we have a wonderful turnout here in person. Thank you all for coming out. And we are also live streaming this event. A recording of tonight's discussion will be made available and shared on the Fargo Public Library's website and Facebook page tomorrow. And I'm sure Hollie from the Indigenous Association will probably be sharing it as well. We plan to monitor questions both from the audience in person as well as via Facebook and YouTube, and post them to the panelists as time allows, during or after. So again, tonight's title for the event, American Indian Boarding Schools and the Doctrine of Discovery. Tonight, our panelists will discuss how federal policy and religious doctrine have served to advance religion as an expression of free market capitalism at the expense of indigenous communities in the U.S. All right, tonight our panelists are Joseph McNeil. He is an enrolled member of the Standing Rock Sioux Tribe, General Manager of the Sage Development Authority, General Manager for SR Development Corporation, Rock Industries Corporation, and Chairman for the Oyate.
Good job.
Thank you. I practiced and in Fort Yates, North Dakota. He is married to Sheridan McNeil and share 4 children. He was recently awarded the Bush Foundation Fellowship for Leadership, MIT Ochete Shakoway Inaugural Fellow, and is an activist for Indigenous rights and a community economic development. He earned his BS in Business Administration from Sitting Bull College. He is a former member of the Tribal Council for Standing Rock Sioux Tribe, Sitting Bull College Board of Directors, and a member of the Wind Energy Tribes United. All right, I'm just gonna set this down so I don't drop it. Next, we're moving on to Karen Van Fossen. She is a descendant of settler colonization with roots in Ireland, Scotland, Holland, Switzerland, and other European nations. She is a licensed professional counselor and ordained Unitarian Universalist minister, affiliated with the Green Sanctuary Program of the UUA. As a water protector, she is part of the No DAPL Political Prisoners Support Committee, Rattler Support Committee, Little Feather Support Committee, and others. She is author of a memoir, Almost Human, The Making of an Accomplice, which is forthcoming in 2022. Hollie Mackey is an enrolled member of the Northern Cheyenne Nation and associate professor at NDSU. Her scholarship empirically examines structural inequity of Indigenous and other marginalized populations in educational leadership and public policy through multiple critical frameworks and methodologies. As an experienced policy consultant, public speaker, program evaluator, and community educator, she seeks to bridge theory and practice as a means of addressing complex social issues from interdisciplinary perspective. She currently serves as the interim executive director for the Fargo-Moorhead Indigenous Association. She earned her bachelor's and master's of science in public relations at Montana State University in Billings, Master of Legal Studies in Indigenous Peoples Law at the University of Oklahoma, and PhD in Educational Leadership and Policy Studies at the Pennsylvania State University. And with that, I will turn it over to my panelists.
Thank you so much. Sorry about the bios being long. And I wanted to just say, I'm sorry, Joseph, I totally didn't warn you for this. I wanted to take just a moment before we start to acknowledge the city of Fargo and the city of Moorheads, where both mayors recently signed proclamations recognizing the 30th of this month of the Day of Truth and Reconciliation. So we're really proud to be members of a community that is willing to recognize us and support us. And we can see by the audience and the number of people who are online that we do have a lot of support. So thank you all for being here as well. I was supposed to moderate this panel at first. I didn't actually plan on being on it, so I'm going to kind of play dual role here. But I did want to turn it over now to Joseph so we can start in prayer and open in a good way.
Thank you very much. I'm going to stand, but I ask everybody to sit. As in our culture long ago, we didn't have chairs. And when we sat and we got together as Teoshpai, as community, everyone would sit. And the person who would stand to pray because he would be closest to Tukashila. So in that way, thank you very much. Wopila tanka Tukashila dewa kantanka. Ikchewa chashelo, I'm a common man. And thank you for bringing our relatives here today. Those who are related to us and those who live amongst us as neighbors, to have a discussion, to share our words, to share our truth, but to share the truth as we have this discussion so that we can come together and understand where we came from so we know where we are going. The histories and the pain of our relatives that suffered and survived, that we could be here today to speak, Wopila Tankate, being with them in thy kingdom, be with our relatives yet to come, and help us here that are in this world today to speak in the present so that we may listen to one another. We may have an open heart and an open mind, that we may put our heads together. You give us this life. You give us purpose to be here, and help us to do and endeavor daily that we may serve one another, serve each other, and serve you.
Thank you so much for that. We appreciate your words. So to begin with, I think understanding kind of the premise of this panel would be a good place to start. So the way that this conversation started really through the Canadian First Nations boarding schools, where they were starting to identify children who had been buried. We started a conversation in this community, primarily led, I think, by Tanya Redroad, in asking the faith community where they were in this, because it was a question that was coming from our Indigenous communities. And in this community, our faith community answered. There's a council of interfaith leaders who all get together. And so when Tanya posed the question to them to get a better understanding of what the faith community in this region was doing, a lot of conversations came about that led to this panel tonight. and to our event tomorrow featuring a tribal historic preservation officer speaking about the importance and the role of that position within the tribe, and then culminating on the 30th, on Thursday night, with a remembrance walk for those of you who are interested. So I think with us talking about this, we really wanted to think about what are the effects of the doctrine of discovery in colonization, right? Which led to boarding schools, which led to a lot of trauma and networks of mess that we're trying to kind of dig ourselves out of still today. And so we have really two experts, right, on this with us today. And I think it would be helpful, perhaps, if Joseph, you'd like to start us out by talking about what exactly the doctrine of discovery is and what people should know about it for this conversation.
Sure, thank you. I by in no means am an expert in anything. I just endeavor to know and endeavor to share. So with that being said, it has always been in my family, always looking back to know our history, what our family history is, and where our people came from. I am Hunkpapa Lakota on my mother's side, and I am Black. I'm African American on my father's side, and on his side there's civil rights struggle. And on my mother's side is surviving and civil rights struggle. Both sides survived. I think at times to put me into a place where we can speak about things like this. Why did we learn the things we learned as we were children to bring us into a place today where we can have a discussion? When we talk about the doctrine of discovery, I think it's relatively unknown for most United States citizenry or Canadians or anyone who lives in North and South America and all the colonized countries around the world, Australia, New Zealand, the Philippines, everywhere in Asia that were once just colonized countries. And the doctrine came from the Pope back in 1455. He written a papal bull, which is in essence something to be indoctrinated, to say this is law. And he written a papal bull for Portugal, as Portugal had endeavored to go to Western Africa and colonize Western Africa. So they needed a religious permission to do so. So they did that. The monarchy in Portugal went down to Africa and started having that practice. In 1492, Columbus, of course, came to the Taínos, the land in Puerto Rico, and went back. And when he went back, the information was, of course, there's this new land. And so he met with the Pope.
Can you talk a little closer to your mic, please?
Sure.
Or move it closer to you.
There we go.
Thank you so much.
Great. So Columbus's trip, sponsored by the Spanish monarchy, another papal bull was issued to Spain. So here you had on the Iberian Peninsula, Portugal and Spain, now as colonial powers. This was a dispute between the two. So they had what was called in 1494 the Treaty of Tordesillas. And in that it was decided that non-Christian lands fell under the doctrine of discovery. During this whole time, there was the Crusades. So dark-skinned folks, anyone who was dark-skinned and was not Christian, was held into a certain class or category of less than. So this doctrine, which all European states then relied upon for exclusive rights under Christian canon law to colonize foreign peoples, included the Dutch, the British, the French, Portuguese, and Spanish, and ultimately the United States. In 1792, the United States, Thomas Jefferson claimed that the doctrine of discovery was international law and could be applied to the United States as well. So there we go. In that context, is a basis for exclusive land rights, which led to all other law being built upon that for commoditization, not only of land, but let's not forget the slave trade that occurred during this whole time as well. Most of the European states, under this doctrine of discovery, had accumulated great wealth through the colonization of Africa and had practiced. And I think when we look at this, we have to look back at the practices that occurred before they came here. So the practice of colonization and brutality, enslavement, and taking of the resources created great wealth for countries like Belgium, Holland, Dutch, the Dutch, and the French, the British. Also, their ability to travel the world. So, with their ships and their trade routes, the ability to use that technology, perfect that technology, haul with that technology, trade and commoditize with that technology, created a great advantage for them, not just in the ability to transport, but in the ability to weaponize their agenda. So, and I don't mean that in a way to say that there's an agenda, but when there was money involved and wealth accumulation involved, suppression of peoples were involved, weapons and weapons of mass mutilation were also involved. So when we go back to look at the history that occurred during the Crusades, the lords and the barons had moved towards on a religious war that was funded, became a war of finance to move the Moors and the Muslims out of Spain, and then to go into the Middle East and Northern Africa. So I think we look back at movies, and it's a great place to say, in movies that, there was these crusades, and these lords went down to retake Jerusalem. But that only tells that little inkling of what that story really was about. And that was to control and maintain the goods and resources and the trade routes that those countries represented. So as we move forward into the indigenous people of these places, their rights, according to the Doctrine of Discovery, were entirely disregarded and to a considerable extent impaired. And that's not just a description there, but that's the description of what has occurred here in North America and South America. All indigenous people, according to that, could live on the land, but title resided with the discovering power, whether that be Spain, Britain, France, the Dutch. And the indigenous people were held as domestic dependent nations. That still occurs to today. As I'm from Standing Rock, we have Cheyenne River. All of the tribes that exist within these 3 states still exist that way. Our land is not our own land. It's all held in trust. So when people say, you guys have your land on Standing Rock, it was during the Dawes Act and the Homestead Act, those lands were fractionated. Those lands that were ours were sold and or given away so that we cannot hold and maintain an accumulation of power. So when we think about the Doctrine of Discovery, it still exists today in the policy that we live with. It's just looking to your neighbors and having the discussions. And I think with that, I'll kind of hold on for the rest of the discussion here. There's a lot more to talk about. I don't want to rant on.
Well, there's a lot to talk about, but that's fascinating. So I appreciate you sharing that, and I appreciate you taking the time to know that as well as that you know that, because I think that there are often times that we forget that there are many, many different relatives who are impacted by the Doctrine of Discovery besides just our relatives on this continent, and it's all relevant and it all matters. Mm-hmm. And I think it traces really a trajectory that we have yet to really grapple with, right, in any intentional way, particularly for our friends and relatives who follow the Christian faith. Right? So one of the things that we had talked about kind of as a product of this Doctrine of Discovery is the idea that there's an ideology, there's a worldview that undergirds it, that provides a certainty for the necessity for something like a Doctrine of Discovery. Or, when I'm teaching my classes, I often will ask my students if it makes sense to them that a group of persecuted people fleeing one country would come to another country just to persecute, right, and annihilate another group of people. And I always think there has to be this very specific worldview associated with that can justify. So with that, I'd like to turn this over to Karen. One of the issues that we had talked about that we thought was really fascinating is this history of policies within the church that perpetuate this inequity, right? And the quote that we use is that the church's doctrine, right, their policies will materially benefit some while diminishing others. And it was a topic that we thought was really important to think about, not only what we know of today as Christianity, but how it has evolved over time, and how these things that we may have long forgotten about in terms of Christian policy actually dictate the ways that we are still held in trust and we are still affected by the doctrine of discovery today.
Well, all right. Thank you for making a little space for me to share from my heart, I hope. As I've been raised within colonialism and lived within colonialism for my life, I've been paying attention to how it moves and how it doesn't. And it seems to me that for many hundreds of years, before 1492, colonialism has been a very versatile worldview that is always capable of using religious language to justify very anti-human, anti-planet, anti-relational actions. Even in one of the documents that Joseph was referring to earlier, Pope Alexander VI, specifically, as he is declaring that he has the authority from God to tell these monarchies that they can and in fact must claim these lands that already belong to other people, or in fact don't belong. The people there know that those lands can't actually belong to anyone. But in the midst of declaring this mandate from God, Pope Alexander VI makes sure to spell out that there is gold, there is spices, and very many other precious things, like maybe oil or uranium or water itself in our own time. And so it seems to me that while religion, and the Christian religion in particular, has carried this colonial worldview, that those of us who were raised within Christianity, particularly those of us who descend from settler colonialism, if we simply abandon that religious worldview, we're not necessarily engaging in a decolonizing project. George Bush used very, very religious language 20 years ago in the invasions of Iraq and Afghanistan. He spoke about the axis of evil, evildoers. And those were wars of claiming resources, stealing resources from other people of color in the world. And so when Christianity, when Christians, when religious people in these traditions collude with the civic religion of colonialism, we're no longer practicing a faith, I believe. We're no longer one that is life-giving. Martin Luther King Jr. and the co-authors of the Beyond Vietnam speech spoke about this nation as approaching spiritual death. And I believe that is the spiritual place of colonialism. And sad to say, I witness it at Line 3 and at DAPL, in the real deaths of lands and creatures and ways of life of Indigenous people, and frankly, all people. At this point, many religious traditions have repudiated the doctrine of discovery. My own Unitarian Universalist tradition has done that. And that's something, that's really something. And this doctrine is bigger than our religious traditions. It's an entire worldview that captures the imagination, such that, as Hollie said, people who experienced great trauma, my own ancestors were experiencing a genocide against Mennonite people when they came. And then there's a story that can be told about genocides that my own ancestors got behind. Someone, do you need to get your phone? um, I think I'll just stop there for now. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that, Karen. So now that we have a general understanding of the doctrine of discovery, right, and really the role that it has played, we need to shift our conversations over to boarding schools and why we're here today, why the doctrine of discovery is still relevant today. And in fact, in many traditions, I know that we can go back even to the Great Commission, right? This idea embedded within Johnson v. McIntosh, embedded within Cherokee Nation v. Georgia, that not only were the native peoples to this continent savage, but they were unable to care for it. And unless we were putting up fences and planting crops and putting houses in rows, that it wasn't actually using the land according to biblical determination. And so, for those of you who might be more familiar with that, right, I think we're talking about a very long tradition going back into the beginning of the Old Testament that gives us some guidance on how we ended up with boarding schools that were intended to Christianize and assimilate Native children as opposed to allowing them to grow up and thrive within their own communities. So Joseph, would you like to talk a little bit about the kind of original establishment of boarding schools or your thoughts based upon what I've just said?
Yeah, I'll talk about my thoughts. My wife likes to talk about the origination of boarding schools. And, in that, what was his name? But he had talked about save the man, kill the Indian, and as the main tenet of what the purpose was for the boarding schools. And over 500 boarding schools existed around the United States, and then those in Canada. And what we're hearing now today, what we've discovered in this last year, what has turned up, is all the graves and the cemeteries around these boarding schools. And what's hard to understand is that there is no outcry for our children, for our ancestors who passed away in these places. These were places of genocide. And in that word, we're not discussing either, because it's hard to fathom that the United States, in its policy of extermination and warfare upon the indigenous people, were participating in an open act of ethnic cleansing. That when the fabled 13 colonies broke away from King George, it wasn't breaking away from King George. King George told them, no, you can't go beyond the Appalachians. But the imperialistic nature of the colonials that had established the 13 colonies and operated the 13 colonies, that were seeking wealth and personal accumulation of power, it wasn't good enough for them. So they moved across the Appalachians and defied him, then had this war. And all the fables that were built around at the Boston Tea Party. And even in that story, they masqueraded as Indians. So from the time of onset, we were dehumanized immediately. And the doctrine of discovery gave the religious tool that by God, I can look at another group of people and say, you're not human. I don't have to treat you as such. I can treat you as the animals. I can move you away. After we got past the Civil War, and that was done. And that wasn't done so that he could free the slaves. It was an economic war. So after that was completed, the Union Army then moved to finish the purpose of clearing the Western frontier, as it was called. This horrified people on the East Coast who become to be civilized or become to be more acculturated, and they couldn't stand to hear. It was horrifying to them that these massacres were going on, this extermination was going on by the government that they had formed, that they were good Christians. So this is the strange dichotomy between the whole thing. So they wanted to see that there was going to be a shift in policy. So we were going to take these kids of the people that we conquered and make them American. Now, my mother was one of these children. And if you didn't take your children, if you didn't submit your child to go to the boarding school, then they would punish you. They would take your home, or they would punish your relatives, or they would arrest you, and they would beat you. And so our parents and our grandparents didn't want to see each other suffer and didn't want to give up their kids, because we never beat our kids. We never had corporal punishment. But in this way, in the boarding schools, they heard what was coming back, and our children were beaten. This level of violence was levied upon children, and a lot of them didn't make it home, didn't make it past the first year. So if someone was to come to you and ask you, what's your most treasured gift? And you tell them, this is it. I love this beyond all. Well, I'm going to take it from you, and I'm going to change it and make it the way I want to. This is what our parents went through. When the children got there, they were often with people that didn't speak their language, were beaten into submission, and brutalized unto death. Those that survived came back home afraid to speak, afraid to be Lakota, or whatever nation you came from. Because now you have this in your head, this trauma. If I speak, I'm going to hurt someone that's next to me. I'm going to hurt my brother, my sister, myself, my family. And then you have this duality at home in our reservations, and we still deal with this. My mother never taught me to speak because she didn't want things to harm me, to come into me. And now I'm trying to learn how to speak, how to pray, how to be Lakota. And this is 40 years after she's been gone, from that type of system. 60 years. So this is something that we still endure. This is the long-lasting effect of boarding schools and what they had. There's so many more stories. And I would love to hear the stories of people in the room, because you do have your truth that it occurred in all of our families. And if you haven't heard this story, think about when trauma is not just created by the person receiving pain. Trauma is also created by the person delivering that pain. So that's a duality of pain and trauma. And in that, when we recognize we're talking about trauma on both sides, I think is a commonality that we can share. And then understanding what it is missing sometimes from people's lives that aren't Indigenous. We're fortunate to have a grounding with the earth, with our relatives that have passed on, and those yet to come. We're fortunate for that, and I'm a fortunate person, I recognize that. But those that don't, like Ms. Karen was talking about, in a religious system that has such conflict and such controversy of history and such acts of inhumanity that attributed to it, where is the divinity there, the spirituality there? We all have a spirituality of heart, but it's in this trauma from those that hit and those that receive the hit. I think we can find a commonality and move on. But I'll digress.
I don't think you digress, actually. That's, I found it, it struck a chord with me when you were talking about these policies where, I don't know that the majority of people who live in this country understand that while we have the First Amendment freedom of religion embedded into the rights provisions of our U.S. Constitution, right, the rights provisions do not apply on Indian land, and we didn't have the right to participate in our own religions and ceremonies until 1978 with the Indian Religious Freedom Act. Mm-hmm. And I think that this should also be startling when I think about divinity, where people's, where is that divinity? Like, how can we reconcile these overt acts of dehumanizing individuals in the name of God? Right? It doesn't make sense to me. And I grew up in a largely non-religious home, and then found Christianity. And I thought I had found really the answer to everything. And the more that I became familiar with Christianity, the more it did not sit well with me, with understanding the doctrine of discovery, with understanding the Great Commission, with understanding all of the violence that is enacted even today in the name of a God that we all recognize is supposed to advocate for love and peace and humanity. And I think about current policies today in terms of like social services, where we're supposed to help the poor, and the Bible says to help the poor, but in the name of religion, right, we can justify policies that actually further oppress those who are already hurting. And so for me, it's always been very challenging to reconcile the Jesus that I learned about in the Bible with the Jesus that I see operationalized in action by those who claim to follow the teachings of this man who really shared compassion and love for all human beings. I hadn't planned on talking about that, just so you know, but it did really strike me, and I think that we have to talk about this, because from a policy perspective, you know, we understand, of course, right, as we have the colonists coming across the Appalachians and everybody starting to move west, and then we have the U.S. Supreme Court reaffirming their right to do so. We have to actually then start to think about the fact that it was the religious organizations first who the federal government tapped in order to be responsible for the federal government's trust responsibility for tribal citizens, right? And so our original boarding schools were all run by religious organizations, whether that was Protestant, whether that was Catholic, whether that was, well, now more recently there's some Jehovah's Witnesses, right? I know in my home community we had a Mormon school. And so I think that it's also very easy to try to cast blame onto the Catholic Church, because a number of the schools now where they're recovering human remains are Catholic churches. But I think that we would be remiss if we didn't think about the fact that all Christianity, all Christian groups, all of these different sects are in large part responsible at some point in another, whether that was from a previously unfractured line that then fractured into different ways of viewing the world or not. And so then when we see the Office of Indian Education, right, and what we know of now as the Bureau of Indian Education step in, really, it was because it was more of a practicality piece, right, an assimilation piece to come in and have a centralized way of thinking about how to assimilate Native populations. And so we see the remnants of all of the original boarding schools, and we see a lot of institutions that are built in the original buildings of boarding schools. But we have to think about the evolution where churches were the foundation for what we know of as boarding schools. So regardless of how they've moved, right, this legacy exists. And more recently, you know, we know a lot of the boarding schools today, aside from like, you know, the private institutions you might want to send your kid to, we know that a lot of them are still run by the Catholic diocese. And we have one at my home reservation still that I think it's both day school and boarding school. But I wanted to then ask Karen, or you can talk about whatever you want to talk about. But these are just questions like, I really want to know what Karen Wright thinks about this. In what ways do you see some of the action now coming from the different faith organizations in trying to address their role or the ways that they were complicit, right? And I think that your take on it is most interesting to me, because you have a really good way of tying in foreign policy along with like energy policy, along with economic development, along with social services, right? And so you can go in any direction that you want to go in with it. But I think that, you know, while we want to address this issue and make sure that it's brought to light, and again, as Joseph had said, this is a community conversation. So if you have questions, you'll have plenty of time for that. But I would like to hear your perspective on what you think the faith community may be doing from your perspective, or what is it that we should be doing moving forward, because we had conversations about, right, we can have this idea of truth and reconciliation, but reconciliation takes two parties, but it takes an authentic engagement and approach. Like, we might not be at that point. How do we move forward and get closer to that point?
Thank you, Holly. I very much long to be a spiritual person, and I very much long to support other human beings to be spiritual people. And I'm also a settler who has descended from settler colonialism. And that means, as we consider what colonialism is, an invasion, colonialism is a state of invasion. It's a perpetual war by a new nation upon nations already present. So to be a settler in that system means my very body, my very spirit is weaponized. My ancestors were the ones whose bodies, there were a few of the ones whose bodies enabled a progression from one coast to another. They didn't get that far. But they were part of what was going on in the middle. And I think as a person of faith, or a person who deeply longs to be a person of faith, I am behooved to tell the truth as best I can. And that is what those of us who are seeking to repudiate the doctrine of discovery hope to do, at least. There was a Supreme Court decision in the 1800s where the judge writing the opinion said, essentially the logical conclusion of this argument is that we don't belong here as settler colonial people and we should go back to Europe. But that's an incomprehensible conclusion for us, so therefore we're not going to draw that conclusion. And we're going to stick with the way that it was before. So to even tell the truth that we who are settlers, who descend from colonialism, have a real problem. We're here, but we're not really here because anybody who was already here before invited us. Yet I'm here, I'm in this room. These traditional Anishinaabe, Dakota, Northern Cheyenne, and many, many, many other lands. I'm here. I have a problem with what to do about that, and I don't exactly know. And in colonialism, I really should know a lot of stuff. I should be an expert. That's my power. But to be in public, to be in a conversation and say, I believe we settlers have a problem. We who descend from Christianity, Protestantism, Catholicism, Unitarianism, we Unitarian Universalists didn't do a great job in the effort to create mission schools, but the American Unitarian Association did try. So I don't exactly know, but I believe that from that place of not knowing, I might be able to bring a little integrity to the conversation. And that's what I hope as religious people and religious leaders and religious traditions that we can do, to admit in public, we don't actually know. And we might never be the ones who will know. Maybe we're the learners at best.
I think you speak so well about that. And, you know, I think truth is our challenge, right? We're all afraid to tell the truth, right? And I think that the same can be said of our Indigenous communities as well. Like, we go around and we spend a lot of time not telling the truth because the truth is very painful for some people. And I would like for us to start to have spaces where, for those who would like to speak, they can do so. And for those who don't wish to speak, we respect the fact that they might not. And I think it becomes even more challenging when we think about the diverse range of tribal affiliation we have, right? The difference in customs, the difference in traditions. And then we have this really complicated relationship with Christianity where many of our tribal members are Christian. And they're wrestling very, very distinctly with what does it mean to be traditional, to be an Indigenous person with all of this history and all of this understanding of the world, and then how does that merge with a largely conflicting narrative, right, about yourself and your existence and your right to claim space. And that was one of our topics for our panel today. Is when we were talking, we got on this idea of placeholders, right? And so how is it that this moment in time with boarding schools, with all of these children being returned, right, with all of these children who may or may not have been forgotten coming back to us, to our home communities, how does this serve as a place marker for where we're at as a nation? And what does it say about us in terms of where we're going? And I think so much of that has to do with the choices that we make. Right? And I think that between a couple of tumultuous like presidential elections and presidencies, I think it's more distinct to us now than ever that we have a lot of very serious choices to make that have absolutely nothing to do with politics and absolutely everything to do with recognizing one another as human beings worthy to be in space together. And so whichever one of you would like, would you maybe start us with talking about what this says to us as a placeholder, a marker in history?
Got a green light, guys. I think we're very fortunate to be here, to be alive in this century, to witness, to be a part of, to resist, to speak, to listen, to visit with one another, to find solution with our past. Because our children need to learn and know from the history that is being unearthed. We can't hide. No one can hide. The churches should not be hiding this. The governments should not be hiding this. This is the truth. These boarding schools existed for what? For genocide. Understand that word. The United States was the last country to accept the genocide convention. Why? Because of that genocide, we can't look back at the horror of what was done. There's a picture from Wounded Knee that will never be released to the public. And that's a picture of a baby riddled by a Gatling gun. That's America. No one wants to see that America. But that's where this country was formed, how it was formed. Under the imperialistic ideas that we're going to make the world a freer and more libertarian place. When we look back at that history, you have to ask, who would they write those words for? They didn't write it for us. They didn't even write it for women or white women. They wrote it for white men. Those that had power and control had written the laws to maintain power and control. That's our history of where this country came from. But fortunately, those words were written that all men are created equal. Eventually, you're going to have to live up to that. You can bury kids forever. Eventually, those kids are going to turn up, and they are turning up. So in this place and space, we have some decisions to make. We have some truths to come to. And all of us here may have not been part of that actually occurring, but our lives and our place and space in this society benefit from that. The advantages, whether you see you have them or not, are the journeys that you must take and talking to your folks who are not of your own kind. Understanding what other people's lives are like and not just scrolling to see what's going on, but have a conversation and have a real honest look at each other with humanity. with human eyes, that we all have babies that we love, that we all have relatives and we all love to laugh. That's our humanity. So we have that commonality, and we have to put aside that policy because, like they say, you can't take it all with you. But this country was built that we could pass it on to our kids and pass it on to them. But the essence of holding land and excluding it from someone else is that selfishly I'm going to make my land here and me work. And I'm not going to work with my community anymore. As Indigenous people, we're always of community. We all had a place and a space and a job to do that served our community. And our communities moved together, lived together, worked together, prayed together, everything together, celebrated and honored each other. And we still celebrate and honor each other today, together, even in the most desolate of poverty. When I go home to my home, and I go to my relatives' homes, and some live in severe abject poverty. And what do? I help when I can, do what I can, how I can. But these are my relatives, and this is still going on. So this doctrine of discovery and putting people away, reservations were so widely admired that in South Africa they modeled how to put Black people away. In Auschwitz, they modeled how to corral and destroy people, the Jews. But isn't it something to say that the Jewish people have a museum in the National Mall to talk about that tragedy? And it is a tragedy. We must come to terms and face what had occurred to us in this most horrific tragedy. Over 60 million people died. 60 million people died. And yet we're still having policy that are crossing pipelines against my land, endangering my water and my kids' chance to drink and have a life. For who? Individual profiteers. Let's write another doctrine of discovery. They don't have to because it exists, but we have to know the truth and what undergirds it so that we can start telling the truth about it and coming to terms and dismantling it so that we can be community, because we're not going to survive, in particular this day, if we're not community. Hechatulo. I'm preaching now.
Yeah.
Watch it.
Thank you for that question, Holly, and those insights, Joseph. For me, I think this moment that we're in, of finding these graves of beautiful people, beautiful young Indigenous people who died, who were killed in boarding schools, is one more reminder that colonialism isn't working. And I don't believe that it ever has. And you spoke of this individual profiteer. And I've been thinking about this a lot lately, sort of the world in which that individual profiteer lives now, compared to the world in which any Indigenous person lived 5,000 years ago. What a dramatically reduced planet even that very wealthy profiteer lives in, compared to any average human being in those thousands and thousands of years before the invention of colonialism. I don't know if you've read The History of White People, which almost sounds like a joke. Nell Irvin Painter, who is a Black historian, has written The History of White People and says in the intro, you might be wondering if we could possibly anywhere in the world need another history of white people. But this is the history of the formation of white people as white people. And early in the book, there's a long, long paragraph. And someday in my life, I'm going to memorize that paragraph. And it's a list of essentially the lost tribes of Europe. My indigenous ancestors from way back are in there somewhere. I don't know where. That colonialism wasn't good for them then. It isn't good for indigenous people now. And I don't believe it's even good for those of us who descend from it. There's a difference between material wealth in a context of competition for that wealth and an actual experience of physical aliveness and spiritual well-being, which I am desperate for. I think it was Ben Franklin, it was somebody in the Ben Franklin world, who's recorded as having commiserated because all these English people on the eastern coast kept leaving those colonial outposts and were invited in and welcomed in and were joining indigenous nations. And almost nobody was doing the other way around. And there's been a lot of pain and a lot of trauma since then, and I'm not trying to romanticize anybody's experience ever. But I can say at Oceti-Sakowin Camp and other water protector camps resisting the Dakota Access Pipeline and Line 3 now, those are the places where I have experienced the most sustained sense of actual wealth ever.
Thank you so much. I kind of feel like we should have ended on that. But we still have 30 minutes, friends. So we wanted to make sure that we did have plenty of time for anybody to talk about whatever it is they might want to talk about. And I know that we do have Representative Ruth Buffalo here, and I know she does not like to be recognized, but I know we also have Wayne Trotter in the back, and he came up specifically to talk about boarding schools and perhaps Senate Bill 2304. So thank you very much, Ruth, for being here. And Wayne, I think there's many ways to wrap in questions about 2304 and really the role that very important legislation does to advance our understanding of this boarding school moment in time, and how we can correct some of the misconceptions or better educate people about what can be done. And shameless plug again, tomorrow there's a tribal historic preservation officer talking who can tell you far more than we could possibly tell you about what goes on with that and making sure that we're going about this in the right way. But do we have, first of all, Lori, do you have the mic? Okay, do we have anybody with any questions for any of the panelists or any ideas that you would like to share with us or any stories? This is really a space for you. This is a community conversation.
Hello, good to see everybody. I have two questions. The first question is, where can we find that link to the meeting tomorrow night?
Okay, that one is easy. If you go and you like Indigenous Association and you go to our events, it's on there on Facebook, or I can email it to you.
Okay.
And so if any of you are not on Facebook, which, I create a lot of events there, we also have some flyers. I'm happy to give you that Zoom. It's all virtual tomorrow, and I'm happy to give you that link after this.
Okay. This may be a shared question because I don't know if there's a specific answer, but what was the beginning of the end of boarding schools? Like when you build a space, for this to happen, it's very difficult for things to change, but something significant had to have happened that there's not these boarding schools anymore. So what was the beginning of the end that made people actually aware of what was going on, or that would lead to a decline?
Yeah,
Right.
I would say similar to the Doctrine of Discovery, I think that we are, as Americans, very nimble with adjusting our policies to continue for the same outcome effect, regardless of what the inputs are. So in terms of education in particular, I just was with a group of educators in Colorado earlier today talking about this. Our schools today, our public schools, still continue to assimilate and colonize and really function as boarding schools. And when you add into that standardized testing or the lack of curriculum that reflects any of our students' knowledge or understanding of the world, without having our languages in there, with having all of our customs removed, we're really creating this dichotomy still of one way of being is right? Because everyone needs to go to school, you have to get your job, you have to do all this. But when there's still a disconnect between how communities operate in an Indigenous space compared to what's prioritized in school, even within our own Native educators, right? That you have your state standards, you have the requirements, right? So despite people trying to incorporate culture and language and all of these pieces into education, from the moment they step on campus to the moment they come home, they're still very much in that boarding school mentality, right? English only, making sure that you're proficient in math. You can't have multiple ways to think about math. Or I think about, Danny Lukey's work and learning from Tyrell Ironized in terms of math concepts, where even, people take for granted that math is just math and then culture is culture, where there are really significant dimensions of culture embedded into how we understand numbers and what we do with numbers, and whether or not we would just count, or there's a lot of pieces there. But I would say, and I think this is where the two of you can really jump in and probably know more about this than I do. My general understanding, right, is over time, when things become unbearable for the average American to witness, right? It takes a new form. And I would say we saw the end of boarding schools kind of as we know them into the 70s. But there were still the lawsuits with a lot of the Catholic churches into the 80s, right, for the abuse that had happened. So, when we're talking about boarding school survivors, it's easy, like everything with Indians, right? It's always in the past. When people don't think about, in my lifetime, it was illegal for me to pray. And I'm not that old. Right? Or all of us are either descendants of or boarding school survivors because my mother was in a boarding school. And so it's not that far removed. And so I think that's also where we see, our parents are becoming very strong advocates for our students because all of these things continue to strengthen them and give them a platform. But in terms of when did it end, I would say it has not ended. I don't know if you guys want to take it away.
There are still boarding schools. There are still a few boarding schools out there. I wouldn't just say a few. There's a significant amount out there. And fortunately, in some of them, there are really bastions of stability for kids now that are Indian guided and managed, and the education, what the curriculum is. But, like Hollie was saying, they just still have the ABCs and 1, 2, 3s, of course, as the standards of education. But, and there are discussions about bringing possible, what do you want to call it, dormitories, into some communities where home life is devastating. Our kids go home with the law enforcement level at some of our homes, and the lack of capacity, for underfunded governments, and where we've been placed to live over the last few centuries. These are our homes, and not necessarily we're leaving. So there's a lot of, that poverty we were talking about and difficulty. So at home, and how do kids get a level of stability that they can go to school and eat and be clothed? And some of our folks are talking about creating dormitories again, so that, I shouldn't say again, but there was a dorm, type thing going on with the boarding schools. And there was a level of stability through the 50s and 60s as we got away from the first boarding schools into the different phases of boarding schools. So it's interesting that it could serve as a solution, not boarding schools as they were, but as we've evolved to manage them and make them a place for our kids to have a home life that is somewhat stable. And that's a shame to say, because we didn't put ourselves in this situation. And so while there's the idea that, oh, the poor Indians couldn't do this or couldn't do that or aren't able to do this or do that, we didn't put ourselves in this situation. We were forced into a box, forced to live into a box. And think about this. If you were forced to live into a home and you would normally go out there into your garden and get things to feed your family, then you're put into this box. If you went out there to feed your family, then they came after you and they came after all of your family. All of your family couldn't get rations then. So those were the tools that made us comply. That's where we had to survive. So these are elements of survival, consequences of survival that I'm talking about. We're talking about coming to solutions, and that dormitories may be a way for some communities to handle that that our kids can have food, have a safe place to eat and to sleep and to be educated. Because our families, we've been in such a tough space and place for such a long time. And that's, as an ex-council member, we would try to find solution. How do we solve these things, from within, with our own? And it's tough, and it remains tough for a lot of our communities that aren't next to urban areas, to have commerce, etc. So we're looking for solutions. But I say that not as a way to say that we have problems and that they're unsolvable, etc. But these are the consequences. These are the things that occurred. While a lot of people were made not to and put away so that everyone else could enjoy the land for free. Come settle, come homestead acts, etc. Taking away lands from natives who had title to the land by marrying into, creating such impoverished systems that people had to compromise their own families and lives in order to survive. So for me, it goes back to that quite a bit, because I can't ignore my relatives' struggle.
I have just very, very little bit to say to that question. But looking at the three efforts by the American Unitarian Association to be engaged in missions, and as much as Unitarian Universalists sometimes like to think of ourselves as very, very different from other Christian traditions, if the traditions are similar, it was a change in federal policy and a removal of funding rather than an urging on the part of those religious entities manifesting those boarding schools that seems to have led to that shift. And as everybody has said, Hollie and Joseph, that those policies then became other policies of that we know much about since that time. But it seems that it probably came from a withdrawal of funding on the part of the federal government rather than an urging by religious entities, if my own religious tradition is any indication of what was moving at that time.
I actually did not know that.
I didn't either. But I had made some notes to myself about everything I could find out about these three, and I looked, closed after a decade, federal government withdrew subsidy, lack of funding, failed, so.
Well, and I think even going back to what Joseph was just saying is we didn't choose this. There was never a point in time that we thought that it would be a really good idea to move on to reservations and be cut off and have no claim to our land or be able to do what we want. And I think that's also one of the legacies that supports, right, this idea of the boarding school ideology, despite having moved away from what we knew of as these very traumatic boarding schools, is really thinking about the fact that all of our policies are situated where, if you want to build a house on your land, it's not technically your land, right? It's held in trust. And you have to go through the BIA for everything, and tribal councils have to go through the BIA for everything. So, I would think, like, comparing it to a non-native counterpart, all of the things that people take for granted that they can actually do, that they have the self-determination right to do on their own, is bound up in layer after layer of federal oversight and shackles that prevent us from doing anything. So when people want to say, well, why don't you build your own schools? Why don't you engage in economic development, right? That's the narrative in Indian country, is always like, why don't you just this? Why don't you just that? But I don't think that it's even comprehensible to people who live outside of the governance system, particularly the IRA governance system, to understand the level of oversight and checks and balances that are embedded in governance, when in fact those who are in leadership roles, right, we always hold tribal leaders in high esteem simply for being able to navigate through what those are and do the best they can in the time that they're in office to move our tribes forward.
I think particularly too, to that end, tribes and folks that are doing things on tribes, trying to build community or build businesses that are often ostracized. And I appreciate that, Hollie, what you talked about getting a home. If I want to get a home on a piece of land, I have to take a lease. I won't own that land. It's always held in trust. So imagine living on land that you'll never, ever own. That's all tribal nations that are federally recognized tribal nations, which means we've accepted a constitution that has been dictated to from the government. So, and if we didn't accept those constitutions and how we're going to govern as dictated to, then programmatic dollars were withheld, grant dollars were withheld, housing dollars were withheld. Our ability to live was withheld, living in a box away from everyone else. But the border towns, if we're working on building a credit union and we have a CDFI, and the reason we're doing that at home is so that we have our own level of financial capacity so that our kids can build credit, learn about what money means, and be able to have a checking account, savings account, learn these tools and have something so that you have the tools that you can make your life whatever it is, what you want it to be. Because so often our kids and our families will go from the reservation and go to a bank, and they're uncomfortable in a bank because now all eyes are on you because you're the only Indian walking in a bank, and people are looking at you like, oh, what are they doing here? And you feel that, and our relatives will talk to us about how they feel that. And so getting a loan, getting a home loan, you're going to put it on trust land, it's really severe odds that that's going to happen. So our ability to participate in the economic systems, that exist off the reservation while we live on our own homelands is greatly diminished. Not just through policy that was previously held by racist policies, by bank holders, lien holders, et cetera, that didn't want to work with Indians, didn't want to see Indians thrive. But I think that's just everything. Particularly when we live here in North Dakota, South Dakota, Nebraska, Wyoming, Montana. We have a great concentration of that prevalence of attitude and prejudice towards Indigenous, our own people, and that exists in the border towns. Everybody knows it in this room. And it's not something to say, you did this, but if we're talking truth, and if we're talking about honestly what's happening and what we are doing as people on our own homelands to try and make a difference and a change, it's a struggle. And it's not something that can just happen because it takes a cooperation. It takes a reconciliation. So I do like that truth and reconciliation. But to reconcile means that you have something and I have something. Mm-hmm. But we can never have reconciliation because you've had something and we've never had it. It was been taken away and moved from us. So we have to come to terms with that somehow. She's got a question.
So while Lori's getting across, I'll just point out, if any of you are logging on for the Indigenous Peoples Day celebration that we're holding almost everything virtual, we did actually focus on more contemporary issues that are really affecting communities as opposed to all of the aesthetic components that typically go with. I think that for us it was important to provide an educational opportunity to take all of these issues to a deeper dive.
I just had a few comments to make. I taught at an Indian boarding school in Wahpeton, North Dakota for 18 years, and I taught art, and I had a lot of leeway and kind of, with the standards, you can kind of, do different things. And I tried to represent the students, because at Wahpeton we had, from like kids from 17 different states and maybe 32 different nations. And so it was really kind of a difficult thing to like teach language when you had that diverse population. But I ran up, banged my head against the wall many times with administration because, it's some of the things that I, wanted to teach the kids. It's like, well, you can't do that. And it's like, they bought other artists' work too, but not mine because it was too scary, because I really have a lot of work that's based on bias on the Indian boarding schools and, the effect of Christianity. And that just was not a thing I was supposed to be talking about. And, but I have a lot of stories. There's one man that he grew up there. That's his home. And a lot of the parents too sent their kids there because, it was a place for them to, eat 3 meals a day. And I saw students that were, when they first came in, were like stuffing sandwiches in their pockets, It's like, but you don't have to do that because you'll have food, But that's what they're used to. I also had a student, because they would go home for Christmas, 2 weeks. She spent the Christmas vacation in the back of her mother's car while her mother was drinking in the bar. And she still calls me her auntie. And I have a connection with a lot of those kids. And some kids, the parents sent their kids there because they had good memories of it, And I guess we also have to thank the American Indian movement for some of the changes with the boarding schools. I think that was a huge thing that turned things around for the boarding school situation. But yes, we still have boarding schools, and I could go on and on too, but like testing, it's like our students didn't test well, even on questions like, which of these is Native American food? They'd show a picture of like corn, some wheat, some cheese, and they'd pick cheese because, you get commodity cheese on the reservation. So, but they would get that wrong. Yeah. And I had a lease in Grand Portage, that's where I'm from, and housing took it away from me because they had money to build houses, and my lot had water and electricity. And so it was just gone. So, I'm thinking, I did recently apply again because my kids are interested, but yes, it's never going to be our land. It's a part of the tribal land. But my brother Bill was a land use manager, and he did everything he could to, like keep buying, because a lot of it's like checkerboarded, because people would sell parts of their land for some money or whatever, and out of necessity. And so he made a huge effort to purchase back as much as he can, and they continue to do that. He's passed away now, but I have lots I could say, but I'm going to go with that.
Thank you for sharing, Laura. We appreciate it. We have up front.
In June sepa gawaban bigan kag indishnakas nimidakwe edudam jajijak. I guess to every coin, there's another side. I didn't grow up with that. My grandparents are boarding school, I guess you would call them survivors. I wouldn't, I'd just call them grandma and grandpa. And the teachings that they gave me were not only our traditional teachings as I was growing up, but I also got the best part of Christianity. I got the complete spirituality. And that's what I tried to live by. I lived by our 7 grandfathers, and I lived by the 10 commandments. And it's so easy to combine the two because there's really no difference. My family still owned all of our 40 acres. My brother now lives on the 40 acres that my grandparents and my great-grandparents have. I still own the other side of my family, and I own that 40 acres. It is our land. It is not held in trust. But White Earth is a little bit different than most reservations. We do own our own land unless by some reason it was taken away from us or it was given away. But when my grandparents brought us up, brought my parents up, my aunts and uncles, one of the things that they took away from boarding school was you need an education. My granddaughters just graduated, both of them graduated college. They're 6th generation college. 6. My great-grandfather, my grandparents, my parents, myself, my daughter, and my grandchildren are all college educated. I don't think a lot of families can say that.
No.
But we also know that, when I was growing up, I didn't know we were poor. I didn't know that we had to have running water. But we were so rich in our culture. That is where our riches are. And that's what we still hold. That's what I still teach my children. They are very much in the Christian faith, and so am I, but I am also second-level Medewawin. I combine my 2 spiritualities, and I combine them very well. I pray every day, I do our healing, I do ceremonies. I'm a name giver, I'm a pipe carrier. And I'm also a sinner, as we all are. They have us down on enrolled members. That's the only thing that I have a problem with, is that Native Americans have to prove their ethnicity, like dogs and horses. That's the only thing I have a problem with. And right now I'm fighting on the delegation for Constitution reform for White Earth to eliminate that. We will no longer have our blood quantums. And the other 575 tribes are watching us to see where we go. But I'm also a history teacher. And when I was teaching my history classes, I had, I guess, one of the best of my principals who allowed me to teach the way history needed to be taught. I combined all of the ethnicities here in the United States. So when our African brothers were here, our Native brothers were here, our Japanese brothers, we all went on the same timeline. When our Irish brothers were getting beaten down in the streets of New York, and we had our slaves down in the southern part of the United States, all of that was being taught at the same time. And my principal said, go for it. He said, you're probably sending forth a bunch of anarchists, but that's okay.
They know the truth.
But I sent forth probably about 300 and some, and I'm still in contact with many of them. But you don't have to have, if you have strong teachers, you can come forth and say, hey, I do not like the way this history book is being written. I tossed my history books out. I wrote my own curriculums. I still go into different schools on the reservation, and not only do I teach our history of our United States, I also teach it of our tribes. I teach them the 7 grandfathers. I teach them our ceremonies. I teach them what it means to be Native American, to be Anishinaabe. But when you first had people coming over, you say that, we didn't welcome these people that were coming over on these boats from across. Yes, we did welcome them. Otherwise, they would have died. We taught them our way. We knew agriculture. We knew how to farm. We knew those things. Otherwise, they wouldn't have survived here. And over 95% of Native Americans in the United States are not full blood. And that's because they carry other nations' blood with them. But that's also one thing less than 100 years ago. If you were adopted into a tribe, you weren't half this, you weren't half that. If you married into another tribe, your children didn't have to learn this culture and that culture. You became 100% of that tribe. If you were adopted into that tribe, and you weren't even Native American, you were 100%. We were a loving people. We still are. And maybe that's where our problem comes in. But when you start getting these other things into our minds, because we do have free will. We have free will to be greedy. We have free will to want more than what we need. We take more than what we need. And that's where the problem is with all nations. You can't just say it's our Caucasian brothers and sisters. Because when they came over here on those ships from Europe, we weren't the best people over here either. We warred between each other. We killed each other. We had sacrifices. We weren't perfect. And you can't build, we would love to have, yes, Native Americans are just the best people ever. They're so stoic. They're so beautiful and they dance. But that's not all of it. You have to tell both sides of the coin. There's good and bad everywhere. And if there's anything that you can learn from this boarding school, why did those parents allow their kids to be taken? That's the question. If I had a child and somebody came over and said, I have to take your child, over my dead body, they would. But we have over, what was the number now? 6,728 children that are being found on the boarding schools. Where were their parents saying, no, you can't take my child? What was the reason behind it? I don't know.
And so, Joy, I don't mean to cut you off. I see that we're a little,
Thank you.
little past time. I don't know if we have time for any more questions or if she wants to wrap it up. Yeah, Wayne needs a microphone.
I don't have anything particularly profound to add to the discussion. This is all great discussion. Before you go, I just want to put a plug in for Mr. McNeil. He's my relative from Standing Rock, and I had the opportunity to work with him over a 4-year period when I served as superintendent of schools at Standing Rock. What I can say about Joe, man, can he cook.
That's right.
That's all I got to say.
Thanks, Blake.
Well, I'm intrigued that,
Yeah, so I don't know if we have some quick questions in the back. I know, like, in our communities, we would just go until we were done, but I know that some of you have to maintain a schedule. So let's just see if we can get a couple more in here.
I just wanted to make two comments I want to make. In talking about the boarding schools, and that's one of the main reasons I came here today, was to kind of see what was going on. But the comment I wanted to make is so many Natives had their parents put in boarding school. It was not nice. It was sad. Now, the one thing a child loses or a parent loses when they are in boarding school is the most precious gift that they can get is the love of the mother, their dad, their brothers and sisters. When they are taken from the home, that is lost. There's a disconnection there from the family, the mother, the dad, brothers and sisters, that a child feels. That disconnection can never be brought back. Those formative years that you, as a child, go into a boarding school in first, second, third grade, you don't get that hug at night. You don't get a story told to you. You do not get a kiss on your cheek. Good night, child, I love you. You don't get that. So that disconnection that every child goes through, maybe that's what creates some dysfunction in many Native families that we have today. That dysfunction started with boarding schools. That's my belief. And the comment of why do kids go, that they would stand there. About 2 months ago, I was talking with one other lady in my community. She shared with me that when it came time for school in the fall, when it came time for school in the fall, back in the 40s, 50s, or 60s, her mother or her grandma would hide her children. Because they, whoever the powers of be were, they would go by and pick up your child. And if you tried to stand in the way, you got punished. Mm-hmm. You didn't get your rations. Mm-hmm. Rations were something that we're dependent on. So that is one of the reasons I feel that so many children were taken away. And no matter how you fought as a mother, as a dad, the government didn't care, the churches didn't care. Your child was a commodity. Your child was there to civilize, to make you more European, whatever it is. So my mother was a product of a boarding school. She passed away at 100 years old and 17. And I'm a product of a boarding school. Boarding schools, like I said, are not nice places. And now for the other part I wanted to ask the guys too, Carlisle Indian School, I understand, was one of the first, possibly first schools that were set up for Native Americans to go to. It was my understanding, and maybe you can correct me if I'm wrong, Native children from all over the United States went to Carlisle. And I was told from history and whatever, the reason so many kids were taken from reservations and placed in Carlisle was to control the leaders of every tribe in that community. If you do not obey me as the government, I control you, I own you. If you do not do what I tell you to do, your child will suffer the consequences, or you will never get your child back. There were children out in Carlisle that had passed away. Parents were not told of it till years later. If their child died over there, they had no way to bring them back home. So the idea of boarding schools, I'm telling you guys, it wasn't a happy thing. And that dysfunction, I believe, is in my family. It's with me, my mother. Like I said, the most precious, valuable gift any child gets is the love of their parents. And when you're out of that home for years, whatever it may be, 1st through 8th, high school, up into high school, something is lost. And it's hard to get that back. So think about that sometimes, you guys, when you see some of my people, my cousins today are lost souls.
Yeah.
And they too are product of boarding school. Their parents were product of a boarding school. That dysfunction, that loss of feeling secure, feeling something, their spirit was broken. Your spirit is broken and you're beat down, and it's hard to get that back. Very hard. So whenever you see some of my relatives, please don't judge them too harshly. Try to have a little compassion and understanding of what they may have gone through their parents who didn't have that love that they lost when they were taken from their homes. But I thank you. Excuse my emotions. It's a sad thing to say something about.
Thank you for sharing your comments with us. We appreciate that. So we're going to wrap up. Usually we would have each of the panelists kind of sum up everything that was said, but we wanted to make sure that we let people talk. I will just say, if you are looking for opportunities to learn more, Denise Lajmadir, Dr. Denise, has a fantastic book that is based around the North Dakota boarding school experience, but then has the most comprehensive map of boarding schools in the world that she's investigated and found. It's Braiding Rosaries, I believe is the name. And then I would encourage you to attend any of the remaining One Book, One Community events to learn more and interact more with our Indigenous community. It's one of the rare times that the city's interests and the community's interests around bringing about greater awareness for Indigenous issues has converged, right, in recent years with different initiatives overlapping. So I'm just do you want to say anything in closing?
I want to thank everyone for being brave enough to speak today, because this is a conversation. And thank you for coming to have this conversation. I want to thank my Tui for speaking, for talking about your lives and what has occurred, because yes, there is a lot of, I agree with you when you say lost. You know, our relatives are been in a rough place and are still in a rough place, because you don't commit suicide at 13 thinking you have a future. And that's where our kids are. At home, we lost so many kids, you know, between 9 and 16, and even in their 20s. Even in our 20s, my relatives are doing these things. So it's tough what has occurred behind all of this. And it's our healing that we're looking to make. So again, I want to thank you for coming and having this conversation, being part of a conversation, listening, and I hope we can converse more as we go down this road. Wopilatanka.
I'll just briefly say thank you again. It's been an honor to be with you. I believe it's been our intention that sharing some of our stories and hearing one another's stories can be one small part in something that might someday look something like healing. And I thank you for holding the space in this practice together.
And thank you to all of our panelists tonight. This was very thoughtful conversation, and I so appreciate your time and everyone else here who came. This is just an amazing community conversation about a very important topic, well, nationally as well, but I always think too locally, just knowing there are boarding schools still, in North Dakota and have been in the past. One teaser for, we have another community conversation coming up in October, working again with Hollie and the Indigenous Association. And the topic of that will be MMIP, Missing and Murdered Indigenous Peoples. It will start at 6:30 p.m., and I believe it will be held here as well, and we will also stream it. Other than that,
Evaluation sheets.
thank you. Yes, there are evaluation sheets on a table over here with some pens. If you could take a moment and complete that, we would appreciate to get your feedback. Thank you and have a good night.